Okay, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this fourth session of our Masterclass series on sound industrial relations. We still have some people joining the meeting, but I would suggest that we get started. This Masterclass series has been developed by the International Training Center of the ILO, and it's based on the ILO Industrial Relations Global Toolkit. And today we are going to focus on industrial relations in times of crisis. And Sylvain Baffy, who is Senior Program Officer at the ITC, will very shortly take us through this new training module. I would just like to say a few words as introduction. So we will talk about industrial relations in times of crisis, and particularly we will look at the positive role that employers and workers' representatives have played and can play in order to tackle the impact of the crisis and build more resilient workplaces. You might have seen that last year, the Global Deal published a brief on social partnerships in times of the COVID-19 pandemic, and it contains many good examples of how social partners acted very quickly to find common solutions to the crisis. Among those solutions were short-time work, for example. We also published the Global Deal flagship report in October last year, and in this report, we also focused on social dialogue in the pandemic and also skills. And here we also have a number of examples of all the work that social partners have done together to address the consequences of the crisis. I think that one of the challenges is that inequalities are worsening as job losses and cuts in working hours and wages disproportionately occur at the bottom of the income distribution and in non-standard forms of employment. But the report also demonstrates how collective bargaining has been instrumental in keeping jobs, adapting pay, working time, and work organization. And these are things that we will come back to during the day today. So, but before we start, I would also like to emphasize that we have maybe some new participants today. I know that many of you have participated in several of the sessions so far, if not all. But for those that did not, you can find the videos of these sessions on our website, and you can also access the training materials on the ITC website. And we also have one more session left, which I would like to make some publicity for. So it's the fifth session that we will organize next week on the 30th of March. It will focus on gender equality and non-discrimination in the workplace. It will be the same time as today, so it will start at 2 o'clock in the afternoon. So that's next week, Tuesday next week. And as you know, we try to make these sessions a bit different. So we mix presentations of the training material with breakout sessions and interesting speakers and various activities. But before handing over to Sylvain, I would also like to stress that this masterclass is part of a broader capacity building program that we launched for Global Deal partners last year. And this is part of our work to strengthen capacity to enable effective social dialogue and sound industrial relations, which is one of the key pillars of our work. And another important part of our work is to increase knowledge of the benefits of social dialogue by developing and sharing good practices and providing research. So I encourage you to have a look on our website for our latest briefs and good practices. But I think it's really time now for me to stop and to give the floor to Sylvain. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Veronica, and welcome everybody. I'm very pleased to be with you this afternoon for this fourth masterclass series on sound industrial relation, on industrial relations in times of crisis. So welcome everyone. I'm pleased to see you. And let me start first by presenting what is the agenda of today. What we have planned for today is to start by presenting what the ILO is doing in terms of the new training modules that has been developed on our industrial relation toolkit. And together with my colleague Ambra Migliore from the Labor and Collective Bargaining team in Geneva, we will be discussing about what the ILO has been doing and about these new training modules on industrial relation and the crisis. Then two ILO officials will be with us to discuss about the impact of COVID-19. The first colleague is Arun Kumar, is a collective bargaining and social dialogue specialist in the ILO Decent Work team for East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. He's based in Bangkok, and he will talk about the experiences, some experiences in Asia and the Pacific. So in terms of social dialogue and COVID-19. And then a second colleague, Niran Ramjutan, Chief Technical Advisor in the ILO Country Office for Bangladesh, will be discussing and will be telling us about what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the Bangladesh garment and textile industry, and to talk about the role of social dialogue and harmonious industrial relations. So these two ILO colleagues are with us, and they will be sharing some insights and what has been happening in the countries in which they are operating, We are also very happy and lucky to have Anne-Catherine Kudenek, who is the National Secretary for Europe and International Affairs of the Confédération Française de l'Encadrement Général des Cadres, to be discussing with us and to discuss about what they've been doing to mitigate the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic in Airbus. Actually, I know that our presentation and our discussion will be not only about what has been happening in France, but we'll also be looking a bit at the European level. And then what we'd like to do is to have a discussion, and especially an interactive group work, to reflect on the impact of the crisis on industrial relation. And the last 25 minutes of our sessions today will be to discuss together about the impact of the crisis on our actors of industrial relation, and also to show you some very simple tools that can be used to do training at a distance, and can be used to foster discussion and exchange of information. So this is what we have planned until I give back the floor to Veronica for closing the session later today. So that's the agenda for the day. I would just like to remind you a couple of things. The first thing is that we're going to run this interactive exercise. In order to participants, please make sure that you have the latest version of the of Zoom. It's better that you connect using the Zoom client application rather than from a web browser. It takes just a few seconds to download the latest version, so please check your Zoom requirements. We thank you very much for all the questions we've been receiving in advance. They've been shared with our presenters and with our speakers. We'll try to do our best to answer to them. So we'll try to do our best. If you have any questions, any comment during that discussion, do not hesitate to use the chat box. Some of our experts are invited to answer to your comments live. So please do not hesitate to use the chat box. And as always, you know that this session is recorded, as Veronica mentioned. Please keep yourself muted if you are not speaking. And let's start this session. So let's start by welcoming Ambra Migliore. Ambra is a labor relation and collective bargaining technical specialist in the ILO headquarters in Geneva. And Ambra will tell us about the role of the ILO in promoting sound industrial relations in times of crisis. So Ambra, I do not see you in my screen right now, but I know you're around, and I think we can get started.
Thank you very much, Sylvain. Welcome everyone, whether it is good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're tuning in. It is a pleasure to be part of this series of masterclasses and taking on from, I know that you've been in good company of both Sylvain and my colleague Chris Lankas-Laskas in the previous session. I will try to set the scene for the very interesting debate, hopefully, that we will have today with some very frontline speakers, I would say, in sort of addressing and finding solution to the current COVID-19 crisis. In doing so, I would first like to start mentioning and acknowledging how sort of compelling the current crisis that we are facing has been for just about everyone around the world for different reasons. But just to throw some numbers, around 93% of workers have been impacted in 2020 by some type of workplace closure. Likely, we've seen this number dropping down to around 77% in the first quarter of 2021. We know for the different reasons, but including massive vaccination campaign that have been happening around the world in some countries and dropping down the numbers likely of the pandemic. But of course, we know that this structural crisis is very likely be here to stay and goes well beyond the health crisis, reaching out to be a sort of systemic economic crisis. So what does it mean, to face the reality of crisis for the system of industrialization and for social dialogue more broadly? Sylvain, if you can move to the following slide, please. So these series of challenges that I have listed here are sometimes, of course, obvious challenges, and sometimes they're also used as counter arguments for those that would like to, let's say, reiterate or reinstate the inefficiency of bargaining or negotiated solution when it comes to situation of crisis. So we know that the sort of structural differences that exist in the division of capital and labor in a way, or like employers and workers, depending on the definition we want to provide, might be exacerbated in times of crisis. Of course, even more so when the sound system of industrialization are not in place, or even when those are in place, we would see the need for both social partners to try and address with compelling urgency their specific need, which in the situation for what concerns workers, that most likely be preservation of their wages and also of their employment, and on the side of employers, indeed taking into account drop in demand, and also in this specific COVID situation we've seen lockdown, so interruption of production, which has been abrupt and completely unforeseeable. So in this type of crisis scenario, of course, it becomes harder to build trust whenever trust is in existence, and we know that trust is a very, very underlying precondition for any type of social dialogue and exchange mechanism to take place, and even more so to preserve trust, because as said, polarization becomes the sort of like immediate response in each side. So again, one sort of argument that has been often, and we've heard, as the ILO, we hear it often, is that negotiated solution are not quick enough, or might not be responsive enough, because they entail sitting around the table and sometimes going through time-consuming processes, etc. But in fact, we know that while unilateral solution might be more sort of responsive in the short term, they might not necessarily be so in the medium and long term. Why so? Because of course, whenever a solution has been imposed unilaterally, whether it be by the government, whether it be by the employers, the counterparts are very less likely to go along with the solution that have been unilaterally designed by one party. So again, as the ILO, we really foster the crucial role that negotiated solutions have in ensuring both social peace, but also really ensuring implementation of those measures in the medium and long term, and also, of course, diminishing the risk of conflict, at every level at the end of the day, whether it be at the level of the undertaking, at sectoral or a national level. We know that negotiated solutions do prove to have a better impact in the longer term. So, again, social dialogue, and in particular bipartite and tripartite dialogue, have proven their value in this COVID-19 crisis. And social partners and national member states have proven to be particularly responsive in finding solutions to very unprecedented and unforeseeable challenges until the day before. So we've seen that those mechanisms are capable of working, are capable of delivering timely responses, even in when and we've seen this again in this period of COVID-19 crisis, where that might occur also a shrinking of the democratic space. And this is not only true for the current pandemic. We've seen that often in a lot of states, peaceful protests or assemblies have been prohibited, so making like harder for workers sometimes to have their voices heard, but also in other type of crisis scenario, including political crisis and other let's say type of crisis situation. Then again, in facing all those challenges, we've seen how both tripartite and bipartite dialogue, and often in a coordinated manner, have been capable of shaping and finding solutions that are impactful. In particular, why do I say and why do I stress on the synergy between the bipartite and tripartite level? Because of course we know that the type of challenges that the world has been called to face in the last year and a half are something that cannot be addressed, cannot be solved. It's not a one-man job. It's something that necessarily entails different type of responses at different levels. So sometimes, and we've seen how the sort of tripartite response or a coordinated response at the policy level by the member state can really create a sort of enabling environment for other levels of social dialogue to take place. Maybe collective bargaining at every level, but also workplace cooperation mechanism that I know you've already got the chance to see a little bit more in details a couple of master classes ago. So Sylvain, if we can move to the next slide. But it's my intention today to sort of focus a little bit more to the role that collective bargaining had. We know for a fact that I'm a lawyer by training, so I will, of course, by default, go back to our standards. The way that ILO Convention 154 defines collective bargaining is all negotiation that occur between one or more employer organization and workers organization on the other side to determine three issues in particular: working condition in terms of employment, relationship between workers and employers, or relationship between employers and their organization and workers and their organization or organizations. So we see that even though the scope and the wording is pretty broad, we are stick to working condition in terms of employment when it comes to the sort of like one of the three main focuses of collective bargaining. Now we've seen that the COVID-19 crisis, again for the very unforeseen nature of its outspread, has sort of imposed to social partners and in particular workers and employers organization to go a little bit beyond this sort of topical scope of collective bargaining and expand a little bit more the idea of working condition in terms of employment. Why do I say so? Because issues such as working time or wages are topically and historical part of collective bargaining negotiation and collective bargaining agreement. But we in the face of abrupt closures of undertaking, etc., it was needed to find ad hoc solutions, so issues that were really compelling and able to address the very specific challenges of that very moment. So we've seen, for example, how in Colombia, in the sector of the banana sector, following protests, etc., by workers, which were called to go and keep working in spite of the outburst of the pandemic. A negotiated agreement has been found, and in the agreement, issues such as protective equipment, but also periodical sterilization of the workplace have been included, ultimately securing to workers a safe environment. So we've seen, again, one of the sorts of outreaches of this new series of collective agreement and acts. I would stick to the sort of classical wording of collective agreement, has been the issues related to occupational safety and health. Of course, another major problem has been, to secure wages and to ensure job security. And another issue that we've seen has taken, of course, a very, very central role has been the issue of telework and working time arrangements. So we've seen that, for example, in a number of countries, through limitation of the working time and making use of time banks, etc., social partners have been able to overcome the crisis. Now, just quickly on the last slide, and then I will hand over to Sylvain. So, in consideration of all these different issues, and coming from the demand of our field colleagues, and we will hear directly today two of our field specialists and colleagues that have been directly in the front line of the COVID response. We've been asked to support in the development of this new module of the IR toolkit on industrialization in times of crisis. Why so? Because often the training space offers a level field, especially in situations where the two parties may not necessarily engage. So whenever the stress or whenever the polarization of the two sets of interest becomes too intense, parties may not necessarily be willing even to sit at the same table. Now we've seen, and capacity building is a core part of the work that the ILO does, that training spaces often, soften up those situations of tension and might enable social partners and may enable parties that do not necessarily cooperate or are not necessarily even able to interact with each other to through the training space to engage in constructive exchanges. So the training process really becomes propedeutic for engaging then in a negotiation or engaging then in dialogue that brings to shared and negotiated solution. So all these other points, I would say, will be soon addressed by Sylvain, but just to say that, unlike all the other modules of the IR toolkit, this module is really meant to combine both the soft skills and the sort of more technical issues, again, related to working time arrangements, to occupational safety and health. And in doing so, we've been relying heavily on the different technical specialists, both in Geneva headquarters and in the field. And we've been really informing the content of this module. So it's been a very, I would say, productive and important work going in the two directions. From the Geneva side, in try and respond and provide the needed support to our field colleagues, but also, of course, from the side of our field colleagues in keeping us up to date with every latest development and everything that was happening on the ground, because we wanted the module to respond to the effective needs of our constituents and not just be, an exercise for ourselves. So as always, we're trying to produce things that are helpful in practice. So Sylvain, without further ado, and I hand over to you to dig a little bit more in detail into this new module.
Thank you very much, Amber, for this explanation. I'll be very quick from my side. I think that what I'm going to say might sound a bit like a deja vu for those that have been attending some sessions. So I'd just like to very quickly introduce to you and to show you very quickly. I think that some of you already had a chance to do it, or you can do it later. What this industrial relations global toolkit, I think that most of you now know that it's a global set of training materials for the promotion of sound industrial relation. You can see on the screen what have been the modules developed so far. And what I would like to show you very, very briefly is where to get the modules on industrial relations and crisis. So we've been covering some of this topic in the past editions of the Masterclass series. Just a kind reminder, this is the platform, the eCampus of the ITC-ILO. You can register for free and you can access many resources and training for free. Just by creating an account and by registering, you'll be able to access a set of courses. And if one day you enroll for another courses, you will see that everything is on our eCampus now. So just to say that if you type Industrial Relations Global Toolkit, you will be able to register and to access directly our home page on the Industrial Relations Global Toolkit, where you will be able to find a number of area of work, including collective bargaining policy and practice, negotiation skills, workplace cooperations, grievance sending, soft skills development. You will see that for some of them, we've been developing, in addition to training activity, a couple of safeguarding tools that you can access, and you can get trained at your own pace, where you want, when you want, on some of these topics. At the bottom of the screen, you will be able to see that we've got this new chapter on industrial relations in times of crisis, where by clicking on, you'll be able to access the menu. So we've been developing a number of new units. Some units are about success stories in times of crisis. Some units are about trust in times of crisis. I'd just like to show you that we've got something about information sharing. That was something mentioned by Amber as one of the critical factors for success, and conflict management, negotiating changes, and transition and retrenchment. For all this activity, for all this topic, we've been developing presentations and training activity for online training and in-person training. And just by simply clicking on some of the units, you will be able to access role plays, quizzes, materials, things that you can use to train people, workers, employers on these different areas. So this is online. You just need to register to access the toolkit. And any questions that you have, my colleague Irene de Orsola can be of support for you to access. But you will see that it's very, very easy to actually address and to use the toolkit. So as we're already a bit late in the agenda, I'm going to hand over directly to my colleague Arun Kumar, who is from the ILO office, Decent Work Team for East and Southeast Asia and the Pacific. Arun is a privileged observer of what is happening in the countries that are covered by his office. So we have asked Arun to tell us a bit about, to give us a bit of insight of what has been happening in the different countries, or some of the countries in the area where he's working, and possibly to share with us some lessons we can draw from these first months of crisis. Arun, over to you. Arun, you are muted.
Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good evening, or you are depending on. Here to share with you some of the development and some ideas that one has seen in practice in this region and in some other countries. First of all, the policy of social dialogue and collective bargaining, governments recognize the importance of this, but practices vary in this region. And main reason for that is that due to the varying degrees of respect that the system has for freedom of association rights in these countries. As some of you would be aware that trade union density in developing Asian countries is very low. I mean, I have some old data which says basically ranging between 2 to 10%, and collective bargaining coverage is even less, basically. 1 to 10%, actually more towards the one side than towards the 10% in most countries. Uh, But it's also true, the idea of collective bargaining or social dialogue, it works if, when mainly in the companies which have a history of consultations and cooperation. And these are the companies that have tended to address some of the issues much better than the ones that never really had the history of dialoguing, recognizing unions, or even, any bargaining history. But these examples are very few in this region, as I'm sure many of you would know. Okay, what kind of issues have the unions where they did discuss with the management, or the managements in the unions discussed? As you know, due to the crisis, many companies, managements are asking for wage cuts or wage freeze. It's been more than a year. In fact, in many places, collective bargainings were due, wage increases were due, bonuses were due, all those things have disappeared. So these are issues now they have to discuss with them. So they're discussing these issues. They're also discussing time compensation these times. Do we, extension of paid leave last year, because a lot of people had to be, because of quarantine restrictions or lockdowns, many workers couldn't come. There's a principle of no work, no pay. So how to overcome that? So many places they, negotiate, extension of paid teleworking arrangements in certain sectors, especially BPO sectors in certain countries like Philippines for that matter. Downsizing issues, severance pay issues, and now they are discussing productivity and performance-linked compensation issues going forward, and safe return to work, OSH measures, PPEs, work arrangements. I mean, it's very clearly one clear issue is what happens if a single case of COVID gets detected in the company. The state's response is shut down the company. Now that affects livelihoods, affects enterprises. So these are all issues connected with safety and livelihoods that are in discussion in countries like Indonesia, Singapore, Philippines, Japan, Indonesia, India, Australia. This is what one has seen happening in terms of dialogue between managements and unions. In certain countries which have a more better tradition of social dialogue, one could also see the peak level dialogue between employers and workers' organizations because they needed to have their dialogue because they needed support from the government. Certain kind of problems can be solved only by government intervention. So for example, in Philippines, the employers had a concern about social security contributions and government was going to raise them. So a lot of small, medium enterprises couldn't deal with them. So the unions and the Employers Association made a joint appeal to them. In Australia, also, issues regarding extended paid leave and also to the contract workers or the casual workers in public sector. The things that civil public sector workers were entitled to, but the ones hired through agencies. So they managed to negotiate similar entitlements. In Sri Lanka also, they actually had a peak level at the Ministry of Labor and national unions and national employees organizations kind of broadly had a framework agreement as to how labor relations issues will be managed, wages and job continuity and those issues would be managed. They had a broad agreement on that. Japan too, the employment adjustment subsidy that the government of Japan finally gave to many SMEs and other enterprises was a result of Rengo, that's the topmost apex level trade union organization in Japan Business Foundation. They together basically agreed on certain measures and proposed to the government. So there have been developments around, these kind of dialogues have taken place. I'm not saying they've all been perfect or everybody was happy with them, but at least in the countries, some countries, these kind of dialogues happen. In most countries and companies, actually a lot of unilateral action has happened, which has obviously created even more problems. Second slide. Okay, what has ILO been doing, basically in order to strengthen this idea of bipartite social dialogue and collective bargaining? I want to say here one thing. in general, most countries and unions and employers, everybody, they all are quite aware of and give importance to tripartite social dialogue. But the weakest link in most of these, especially in developing Asian countries, is the bipartite social dialogue, or as you can see, collective bargaining, how little of it is practiced. It's amazing that, those two parties who actually have a problem with them have no culture or history or tradition of solving the problems at their own level. So this is one of the areas of which I feel is the weak bipartite relationship is at the source of many problems. And as a result of what happens, everybody goes to the government or everybody goes to the courts to solve their problems instead of solving problems at their own level, like many unions in continental Europe do. Basically, there's a more history of bipartite solving of problems, setting the rules of the game in continental Europe historically. They are also under pressure now, but this role of law in Europe is less as compared to the role of social partners historically in industrial relations. But in our region, it's the other way around. It's the law and the state which will solve your problems. So this area, this bipartite social dialogue collective, and I've been doing a lot in years to promote this bipartite dialogue, employers and workers, and at apex level as well as at enterprise level. In fact, in most countries, the law provides for enterprise level workplace consultation and cooperation mechanisms called by different names: labor management councils, bipartite, the cooperation institution, the work committees, works council. These are important bipartite forums in the company, but have historically not been used very well to relationships between employees and workers. They are more as bureaucratic requirement, and so these instruments need to be revitalized. Same thing. Law also provides for improving solving problems at the first instance at the employer-employee level or employer-trade union level. So you have role of grievance policies, grievance machinery, and bipartite dispute settlement, which works very little because they have never really had any organized systems, basically. So that's another area where ILO is trying to work and basically raise the awareness as to how these institutions can be good for promoting collaborative industrial relations, which is not just it doesn't mean these are not institutions for being good to the workers. These are institutions that help enterprise productivity, basically, because disputes, grievances, discontent, basically all these things affect essentially competitiveness and productivity of any company. And what should be the job of any management to improve the rate of return on invested capital? And if for that they have to improve how they deal with labor, they should do it, So these are the kind, and this is what we are doing in Indonesia. Some sector approach in certain countries, sector, palm oil plantations and palm oil mills, and in certain industries, particularly in Laos and Timor-Leste, which are quite underdeveloped even in terms of labor relations institutions. Philippines in special economic zones, which have historically stayed, even Department of Labor doesn't intervene very much, and Thailand, But this kind of work is also being done in Myanmar, in Vietnam, in Malaysia, Cambodia, in South Asia too. And the issues, at bipartite level, when we are trying to promote a dialogue, basically what issues are we focusing on? Not just wages and compensation structures and their negotiations, but also joint approach to productivity and working conditions improvement, and compliance issues through workplace cooperation bodies, compliance with labor law, compliance with standards, and establishing grievance policy and mechanisms. And the final area, there are other things, but these are key focus right now, is also capacity building for collective bargaining, both for gain sharing and for addressing disputes. Everybody thinks collective bargaining has to do with wages. But if you really think about it, wages are negotiated once a year or once in 2 years or once in 3 years. And in case of Philippines, for example, once in 5 years. But collective bargaining as an industrial relations institution has a greater role to play in solving many other concerns of employers and workers, basically. So around to build some understanding and, how to do it finally, how do you know capacity to pay off an employer, what has been your share in the value added? What is the difference between price of labor and cost of labor, So role of production and financial information for collective bargaining, there is lots in the financial information that will tell you about what strategies for negotiation should be followed, when to go on and not to go on strike. If you know how to understand companies' financial information, you'll know. So, and role of productivity, things like that. Next slide.
Aaron, you have 2 minutes left.
Okay. So, these are basically, I'll try and skip if I have only 2 questions, but a few questions I'll leave participants to think about. How do you approach collective bargaining? As a contracting issue or an opportunity for relationship building? Because that will determine the approach of the 2 parties, how they want to do things like that. Managements have a big problem. They want to, do you want to exercise control or do you want to promote commitment of the workforce? In an organizational context, control implies exercise of power. But if you want to promote commitment of your workforce, it correlates to trust and social dialogue, So, do higher wages, higher wage costs? Employers and trade unions have you can fight price of labor or you can work together and collaborate over costs of business, So, and there is a link I've given you. There are many new experiments happening in parts of India and some other places too, in terms of compensation. Okay, the final slide, the last slide. Go on. Yeah. So, concluding remarks is this: social dialogue, collective bargaining generally works well if you basically participate in representative organizations with the right to nominate their own representatives. What's equally more important is capacities to make and deliver on agreements. I think both trade unions and employers in the region don't necessarily have this. Consultations take place in good faith. Well, good faith has been missing for a long time. And it will take time. Equally importantly, discussion should take place based on facts and data and in the spirit of deciding what is right rather than who is right. Most of the time, negotiations happen based on opinions, and dialogue is about who is right. In Singapore, I noticed why things work in Singapore, although it's a very special country. There is reciprocity. Concessions made in hard times and sharing gains when the recovery is made, This breeds trust and cooperation, which makes their system work, basically, And they have a history of last 40 years like that. And the government supports the decisions of the tripartite as well as the bipartite thing through financial as well as technical and other schemes. Final point, dialogue or collective bargaining works if parties have the right to protest and abilities to take action to support their social dialogue and bargaining rights. Well, workers' side in most of these countries do not always have this right or even capabilities to do so. And that's the limitations of the social dialogue here, or what could have been achieved. Okay, I'm done. Thank you. Any questions, we can raise them later.
Thank you very much, Aaron, for this. Any question to Aaron can also be directed in the chat so that Aaron can answer to you directly on the chat box, and also to say that the presentation of Aaron has some other slides we did not have a chance to look at, but you'll be able to watch them and to look at them and to see some of the information that he did not have a chance to discuss with us today on the PowerPoint. So thanks again, Aaron, for your presentation and that very interesting presentation. Let me now turn to my colleague, Niran Ramjutan, who is the Chief Technical Advisor of the Social Dialogue and Industrial Relations Project in Bangladesh. And we have asked Niran to focus especially on what has been the impact of COVID-19 on the Bangladesh garment and textile industry. And Niran will tell us also a bit about what the ILO is doing and the support that is provided in this time of crisis. Niran, over to you.
Good afternoon. Colleagues, thank you, Sylvain. Good afternoon, good morning, and good evening, colleagues, depending where you're sitting in the world. I think I would talk a bit about the COVID-19 on Bangladesh's garment and textile industry, and what we did as the ILO office to support that through social dialogue and industrial relations. I think a bit different from my other colleagues. This is very country specific and also very sector specific. And in the slide that's on the screen now, maybe before I start, just to put some context in terms of the RMG sector in Bangladesh, 4.1 million workers in the sector, so it's a fairly huge sector. 55% of the workers are women and 83% of export revenue. So it plays a very specific and special role for the economy of Bangladesh, and it's important a sector in terms of economic contribution. So what happened when we had the COVID pandemic? COVID-19 pandemic caused chaos in the textile and garment sector. Just in terms of a timeline, what were some of the issues that were dealt with? On the 25th of March, the PM of Bangladesh announces the first fiscal stimulus package, mainly to the export-oriented RMG factories. Indeed, it did have a major economic impact, especially in the RMG sector. The 26th of March, there was the government of Bangladesh introduces a lockdown from the 26th of March, and I'll talk about what that impact had on the RMG sector a bit later. We then found on the 12th of April, the Ministry of Labour and Employment forms 23 crisis management committees, or CMC, and I think the purpose or objective of these CMCs were to monitor payment of wages very much at district level. It was also very tripartite, which means that all constituents were part of these committees. In addition to monitoring payments of wages, it was also there to ensure the security of workers. I think the time we talk about in April, May, Bangladesh was characterized with a lot of disturbances and a lot of striking as well as how this CMCs or committees was then used to promote harmonious industrial relations during the COVID-19 crisis. Next slide, Sylvain. All right, so what was the impact of all of this in terms of the Bangladesh RMG sector? Firstly, according to the Bangladesh Garments Manufacturer and Export Association, and this is the largest employer association in the country, $3.18 billion worth of orders were cancelled. I think this is no secret. It's been largely publicized in the media, so a fair amount of orders were cancelled. This in turn led to about 1.150 factories that were affected and also impacting on 2.28 million workers. So as we can see, from an impact point of view, it was quite large and severe on the economy. So in terms of the majority of factories did not follow the layoff and termination rules. And I think this is important where we start looking at how the process of social dialogue and industrial relations started coming in to ensure that this was not, the order of the day. So we see that only 3.6% of factories complied with the compensation principle. That is, there was SRO in terms of the payment of salary and outstanding compensation. So only 3.6% complied, meaning that they only paid the salary and did not pay the other two, the outstanding compensation. We also find about 70% of the factories paid the salary only. Okay, so this means that 30% of the factories or workers in 30% of the factories went without salaries. It was also a time that was highly characterized by retrenchment. We saw retrenchments also occurred due to the shutdown of the factories. So earlier we spoke about the public holidays and the lockdown. We saw a fair number of factories that were shut down. What were the consequences? as many as 232 factories closed, and here I mean permanently closed. Okay, so there was quite an impact in terms of the number of factories, okay, of which 180 were associated with BGMEA. Okay, colleagues, I take this data and statistic from a research paper that was undertaken from an institution in Bangladesh. All right, so we also find that considering changes in employment between pre-COVID and post-COVID periods reveal over less than 50% of factories had less workers in September 2020 in comparison to December 2019. So as you can see, quite a big impact on number of workers at factories. And lastly, what did the pandemic do to unemployment? You know, for Bangladesh, unemployment peaked in 2020 at 5.4%, where it previously generally sat in the region of about 3.5%. Next slide. Okay, next slide, Sylvan. So how did we respond as the ILO? You know, we started a process. First was the development of a brief on a return to work, or we called it a FERA program for all industries in Bangladesh. Okay, and you know, it was built on the following pillars. Firstly, it was to unite the government, employers, and workers around the joint principles of a comprehensive COVID response and action plan. So we can see already it was tripartite. There was also a pledge to workers through the TCC. Now, if I talk about the TCC, it is the Tripartite Consultative Committee in Bangladesh. So it's the highest apex body of tripartite consultation with representation from management, workers, as well as employers. And this was all developed and all in line with social dialogue principles in terms of Convention 144. Okay, I would jump to the next point. And the purpose was also to facilitate a gradual reopening of all establishments and production facilities based on the responsible application of agreed ILO OSH standards and WHO guidelines. And I would talk about the role of the ILO and in terms of the development of the ILO OSH guidelines a little later. It was also meant then to pave the way for post-COVID collective bargaining agreements on harmonious industrial relations, wages, social security, and general working conditions. I think it was important to understand that at the time, some of these issues happened, and it was more important to put in place also a post-recovery or post-COVID way of dealing with collective bargaining. And my previous colleague talked about collective bargaining agreements and the absence thereof in the region. And we started looking at and having some discussions on how we could improve collective bargaining post-COVID to ensure that workers also got an opportunity to get what they deserved. Okay, next slide. So the response was also then based on three components to uphold fundamental rights and standards. The first one was around ensuring a safe work environment, okay? The second component was labor relations and joint problem solving. So, you know, the focus was on joint problem solving here. And the last component was around jobs, employment, and social protection. If I start with this first one, you know, safe work, there was a common agreement on COVID-19 return to work, infectious disease control and prevention and occupational strategy and health guidelines. So this is a guideline that the ILO developed in Bangladesh. And I think here, where was social dialogue in the process? It was part of a tripartite consultative process. So all parties or all constituents had a role to play in the development and finalization of these guidelines. Okay. The next component was the establishment of a tripartite labor relations task team. Okay, and here we as the ILO supported the government of Bangladesh and the constituents in drafting the text for a labor relations task team. I think earlier I spoke about the National Tripartite Consultative Committee that is in place in Bangladesh. But this was the labor relations task team that was a special task team that was tripartite, compromised, consisted of tripartite members, and it was brought in place as a short term, to look at the COVID-19 response. And they would work up until the COVID-19 is still in the country. And then the last one was using the ILO tools and methodologies to support, to protect and restore employment, especially in SMEs. So this was the main characteristics or the three components of our response. And like I said, all of this was done in consultation with the constituents. And most importantly was that formation of the labor relations task team, which brought all of the parties together. Next slide.
Miran, you have 3 minutes left, yeah?
Okay, so how did we do this? We put together with the tripartite constituents a set of training packages. The first one was general COVID awareness. The second one was return to work, occupational health and safety. And the third one was managing labor relations. And they talked very closely to the previous slide that I mentioned, our components that we had put in place. And this training was then taken out to outreach to factory level. Next slide. All right, so what did we have as targets to outreach? We had a total target of 410. And as you can see, there's the breakdown of how we divided that between the unionized and non-unionized factories in Bangladesh, as well as employer association affiliation, BJMEA and BKMEA. We started the process in December 2020. It was a fairly accelerated process, and we hope by March 2021 to have completed it. And I would show you some of the success of this particular initiative. Next slide. All right, so if I look at our achievements to date as a country office, first was the successful development of a set of national OSH guidelines that was used nationally, not only in the RMG sector, and it forms or is the foundation of our training as well to ensure that there is a safe return to work. Going back to the fact that this was always, all of these guidelines developed was tripartite in nature as a result of extensive consultation and as a result of social dialogue. The second was to develop a set of national labor relations guidelines that I talked about earlier. So we also supported the government in the development of these national labor relations guidelines. To support the trade unions, we have a workers' resource center in Bangladesh, and here we supported the Workers' Resource Center with the formation of a trade union rights watch team. I think that was important at the time, and this trade union rights watch team continues to look at if there has been gross violations of labor rights. And lastly, we had capacity development of workers. Okay, next slide. So what have been our achievement in terms of figures? And this is a slide I talked to about in terms of our trade union rights watch team that was developed, that is supported by a group of paralegals. And their main focus was to assist workers on grievances and disputes. Okay, I have data here from October 2019 for a year, so it also includes 2020 data. Okay, so as you can see, we have something called a C form. That's a complaints form. We received about 224 and 148 cases were completed and solved to the satisfaction of all parties. 72 cases continue to be in progress and 4 cases have been dismissed. I think the importance here is then to look at how social dialogue has played a role at grassroots level. These are individuals, whilst we talk at a national level around social dialogue in terms of policy development, guideline development. So this was a group of people that worked on the ground. Okay, so we saw that they were also able, in some instances or most instances, to provide support to field level or ground level workers. Next slide. All right, in terms of our training packages, remember I spoke about we had 3: managing labor relations, occupational safety and health, and COVID-19 awareness. Whilst I didn't touch on the actual content of these training programs, they were largely around social dialogue principles, especially the first one, managing labor relations. It was largely built on grievance handling during times of crisis, as well as workplace cooperation. So we had a target of 410 factories that we needed to outreach in the period till March 2021. And if you look at this slide, it gives you some indication of how we have progressed to date with factories in BJMEA and BKMEA. And as you can see, for example, with the BJMEA, we have to date done more than 250 factories in COVID-19 awareness. How many participants did we cover till 28th of February? We covered a total of 3,812, 2,032 being male and 1,780 being female. So almost a 53% split between male and female. I think mostly the difference come in managing labor relations, where we find that there is a larger contingent of male participants. Okay, next slide. All right, I think Sylvain, that brings me to an end, and I hand back to you.
Thank you very much, Niran. Very interesting to see the numbers you have and the impact of the crisis on the industry and some of the mitigating measures. So thanks very much for your presentation, Niran. Your obviously questions and comments can be directed to Niran on the chat box. And thanks, Niran. And let me welcome Anne-Catherine Kudnek, who is National Secretary for Europe and International Affairs at the Confédération Française de l'Encadrement, la Confédération Générale des Cadres. So Anne-Catherine, thanks so much to be with you. I do not see you on my screen right now, but I know you are with, okay, now I can see you, very good. So Anne-Catherine, thanks very much for being with us, and thank you very much for sharing with us what has been done at the level of Airbus to mitigate the impact of the crisis. And I know that you'll be also covering a bit what has been happening outside France and looking a bit at the European level as well. So Anne-Catherine, over to you.
Okay, thank you very much. First of all, I would like to give you a few information about my union for those who do not know it. We are the 4th union in France, and our members are for 55% managers and engineers, and the remaining 45% being technicians or qualified employees. We are very much present in the private sector and in large companies, but progressing also in the public sector and in medium and small companies. I have been elected as International Secretary in 2019, but I'm also employed by Airbus, although I'm now a full-time union member, and I've been for 4 years a member of the Select Committee of the European Works Council. So as most of you probably know, Airbus is an international company based in Amsterdam and registered as a European company with the headquarters in Toulouse in France. It has 135,000 employees operating in commercial aircraft, helicopters, space and defense sectors, located in all continents and with 4 historical countries, France, Germany, Spain and the UK, which will be the countries I will be talking the most in my presentation. So before the crisis, the company was very sound, with very good perspectives in aircraft and helicopter sectors, although the situation was a little less secure in the space and defense sector. And then March 2020, the crisis, the lockdown, 21,000 aircraft grounded overnight, production frozen, airlines closing, and new challenges to meet, knowing that the date of the recovery will be long and mostly uncertain. Within Airbus, there is a long and an old history of strong social dialogue. we have been used to negotiate several agreements, and collective bargaining is quite intense and has been also very intense also during the crisis. First, we had to deal naturally with the return to work and negotiate the sanitary measures and all the health and safety measures that had to be implemented. So that was probably what was done in several companies throughout the world. So negotiations in France started, and we had to also to deal with the working time of people. Oh, sorry. Got a phone call at the same time. So we had to deal with the way people going back to work could work, because the working time had to be adapted. So that was the first negotiation. And at the same time, in France, we had the opportunity to use state measures that were implemented to ensure that employees who couldn't work were entitled to have 92% of their wage during that time. So that was the first thing. And at the same time, there was also specific measures directed to managers within the company to adapt to the crisis management. A hotline was also installed to prevent psychosocial risks. And finally, there was a questionnaire sent to the employees to know what they could express and how they lived through this difficult experience. And then at the second stage, we had to deal with the economic consequences. That is, at the 1st of July last year, the company announced the reduction of its workforce by 15%. It was called the Odyssey Plan, which involved 15,000 job cuts, with 6,000 in Germany, 5,000 in France, 1,700 in the UK, and 900 in Spain, and 1,300 for the rest of the world. During the crisis, our European Works Council was very active and set up its own video conferencing system in all languages used, which was quite convenient. And the dialogue with the management was pretty good. The Works Council was properly involved throughout the information consultation process and was also assisted by expert consultants. The Works Council had the opportunity to discuss alternatives to job cuts with management. And for all the unions, the red line was the compulsory redundancies. We wanted that the plan would go without compulsory redundancies. So from March 2021, 20, sorry, with the social dialogue at national level and the action of the Works Council, we managed to avoid forced redundancies in the UK, in France, and in Germany. For Spain, the situation is still ongoing, and in fact, the social dialogue is quite difficult for several reasons. But in other countries, such as Morocco, Tunisia, or Portugal, there had been some economic redundancies. So at the moment, the situation in each country is as such. In France, Germany, and the UK, there had been company agreements with trade unions to avoid forced redundancies and to set up alternative measures, such as voluntary internal or external mobility, public short-time working scheme, early retirement, voluntary annual leave, upskilling or reskilling, and also reduction of working time together with wage reductions. There was also measures provided by national governments and support for the aerospace sector, either at national level or also at European level, especially for investment in research and development. But despite those measures, we have accounted job cuts, not in the Airbus company, but in fact for temporary workers, for on-site subcontractors, and also for companies that were used as subcontractors. So at the moment in France, we managed to sign 2 agreements. One for the adaptation plan, or where we dealt with social measures, and the other one is specific to the long-term part-time activity system, as we know that we would not be able to have full employment for full employees these coming months. So this system will normally last 2 years. It concerns 10,000 workers, mostly in production. There is an average work time reduction by 15%, but this could be 40% in certain sectors. And the wage would be maintained at 84% of net wage, with a special negotiation, which I think is still ongoing, for the wages under 2,000 euros, and also a possibility to have a compensation with extra days off. So on top of that, for all the employees, the wages are frozen until the end of June this year, and there will be no dividends paid to the shareholders for this year also. So to conclude, I would like to give you some thoughts about, in fact, what we have learned through this crisis, because we had to turn completely digital for social dialogue and collective bargaining, even for signing the first agreements, because there was no possibility for people to move during the lockdown. And before that, we used to have a kind of little ceremony for the official signature. So this time, nothing was done like that. And also another difficulty that we found is that there was a lack of a quick feedback from our union members during negotiation process. And we found that quite difficult, especially because there was also a lot of pressure from the management, with meetings sometimes every other day, and which made also internal union dialogue become more difficult. So it was sometimes more difficult to keep the union unity because of these different means of communication and the lack of informal physical meetings that we used to have very often. Even if for the Airbus company, well, especially in France, I don't know for the other countries, but in France, we have an agreement for communication of union information within the company through mailing system, email system, and so on. So it wasn't too bad, but it was very difficult because it was the only way we could meet with our members. And also the difficulty came that at the same time, our union representative also had to deal with the discussions occurring at national level in the aerospace sector, and also about the future of the aeronautic sector, and also the plan starting at the European level. So this was quite a difficult time. And finally, what I would like to say is that we managed once again within our group, through collective bargaining and social dialogue, to find alternative solutions than forced layouts employees, but consequences still have been very hard for our subcontracting companies. And now it has just been published, I think a few days now. The company is now working on a new industrial strategy and probably a restructuring plan as usual after a massive workforce reduction, because the company has to be reorganized and possibly to start with the creation of a new a new champion in aerostructures in Europe. So because that will be the main challenge that we have to face in the following months.
Thank you very much, Anne-Catherine. Thank you very much. That's very interesting. That's a very good, actually, let's say, starter for the last thing we'd like to do today, which is this group work. So any question to Anne-Catherine can be directed on the chat box. But so thanks once again. I think that's a very good illustration of what Amber was mentioning at the very beginning about the force and the strengths of collective bargaining and sound labor relation.